The photograph had lived quietly in an antique shop drawer for nearly a century, tucked between brittle letters and yellowed postcards no one dared to read. It showed two friends, arms linked, smiles gentle, the kind of picture that makes strangers sigh at simpler times. Nothing about it should have raised suspicion, not until a historian cleaning the image's surface noticed the faint outline of something tall standing behind them, something that wasn't shaped like a person yet seemed to lean in as though it belonged. As the photo was restored, more strange details emerged, the blurred shadow stretching across the ground despite no visible light source, the unnatural tilt of one friend's head, the way their eyes seemed to follow whoever looked too closely. The historian brushed it off as aging and artifact decay, but that night he dreamed of standing exactly where the photographer once stood. He could feel the cold, damp air, smell the moss, hear the click of the camera, and sense someone exhaling softly just behind him. When he awoke, his room felt colder, and the restored version of the photograph, which he had left face down on his desk, was now upright, positioned perfectly toward his bed. The two friends were still smiling, but their eyes no longer looked hollow and faded, they looked aware. And behind them, in that hazy corner of the image, the shadow had grown sharper, as if it were slowly coming into focus. The discovery of the photo began as an almost accidental moment, the kind that feels insignificant at first but later reveals itself as the quiet spark that ignites something far larger and darker. The old photograph had been lying untouched in a cluttered corner of an antique shop, buried beneath stacks of forgotten keepsakes, discarded family legacies, and time-worn trinkets that no one had cared for in decades. The drawer it rested in was stiff, its edges swollen from years of neglect and moisture, and when it finally creaked open, dust rolled out like tiny spirits escaping confinement. A researcher, someone who had only planned to browse casually, felt drawn to the drawer without understanding why. Perhaps it was the antique shop's peculiar stillness, or the dim light that made every object seem to whisper its own history, but the photograph captured his attention the moment his eyes fell on it. It was a simple picture on the surface, two friends standing side by side, arms linked, their smiles subtle and relaxed. Nothing in their expression suggested staged emotion or forced cheer, their faces reflected genuine companionship, the kind that grows from quiet years of trust. Yet something about the photo felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried a weight far beyond the innocent moment it portrayed. The researcher gently brushed off a thin film of dust, revealing more of the faded image. The two friends stood in what seemed to be a small clearing surrounded by trees, though the background was blurred enough that the exact location remained ambiguous. The sepia tones had softened with age, turning the edges brittle and the center slightly warped. The lighting in the image was strangely inconsistent, as though the photographer had captured it during a moment when the sun hesitated behind a cloud, offering neither brightness nor darkness but an unsettling in-between shade. The researcher tilted the photograph toward the light, wanting a clearer view of the friends' faces, and that was when he noticed something unusual near the far left edge of the frame. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than an accidental smudge, the kind that comes from decades of fingerprints or humidity. But as he peered closer, the smudge lost its ambiguity. It began to take shape, forming a faint outline that resembled a tall figure standing just behind the two friends. It was not immediately clear whether the figure was a person, a trick of the light, or an accidental shadow caused by the camera's old lens. The researcher leaned in closer, his pulse picking up as he realized the silhouette had a defined structure. It wasn't random discoloration. Its posture seemed rigid, its height slightly unnatural, as if it stretched beyond what a typical human frame should allow. Yet the most unsettling part was that the two friends in the foreground appeared completely unaware of its presence. Their relaxed expressions, their body language, their unguarded smiles all suggested they believed they were alone. There was no hint of tension or discomfort, no sideways glance or stiffened shoulders that might suggest they sensed someone standing behind them. It was as though the figure had been invisible to them in that moment, something only the camera had managed to catch. Intrigued and unsettled, the researcher carried the photograph to the counter where the shopkeeper, an elderly man with clouded eyes and a slow, deliberate manner of speaking, lifted his gaze at the rustling sound. The researcher asked where the photo had come from, but the shopkeeper merely shrugged, explaining that artifacts arrived in boxes from old estates, abandoned homes, and liquidation auctions. He couldn't remember which box this particular photograph had come from. It might have belonged to a family that once lived on the outskirts of town, or perhaps it had been tucked in a collection sold off after someone passed away with no heirs to claim their belongings. The uncertainty only deepened the researchers' curiosity, for an object with no traced origin often carried the richest mysteries. The shopkeeper squinted at the photo, bringing it close to his face, and after a few moments he muttered that he had never noticed the figure before. He brushed it off as a possible light exposure error, the kind that happens when old cameras malfunction. But the researcher could tell the explanation didn't convince even the shopkeeper himself, whose voice carried a subtle tremor, and whose eyes lingered too long on the shadow before he handed the picture back. The shopkeeper's reluctance to discuss it further suggested an unspoken discomfort, maybe even fear, though he tried to mask it behind casual indifference. The researcher left the shop with the photograph tucked carefully in an archival sleeve, his mind teetering between logical explanation and creeping unease. Once home, he placed the photo beneath a soft lamp and studied it again, this time with a magnifying lens. The shadowy figure looked clearer now, more pronounced, as though it responded to the light. The outline showed no facial features, no defined clothing, nothing that indicated it belonged to any particular era or style. It resembled an absence rather than a presence, a shape formed not by something but by the lack of it. And the more the researcher stared, the more impossible it seemed that something so distinct could have gone unnoticed by anyone present during that moment decades ago. That night, the photograph remained on his desk. He intended only to analyze it briefly before sleep, but as the hours passed, he found himself returning to it again and again, drawn back by a feeling he couldn't articulate. The figure seemed to shift subtly depending on the angle he viewed it from, almost as if the shadow grew sharper when looked at directly, and softened when seen from the corner of his eye. His rational mind insisted it was an illusion caused by deterioration, yet something deeper, more instinctual, whispered that he had stumbled upon a moment in time that was never meant to be seen, a captured truth that should have remained buried in that forgotten drawer forever. Historians decode the markings not because they were searching for mysteries, but because the photograph seemed to ask for their attention in a way that ordinary artifacts never did. When the researcher brought the photo to the archives, he expected a brief examination, perhaps confirmation that the shadowy figure was simply a damaged portion of the image. Instead, the moment the photograph was placed under controlled lighting, something unexpected happened. The faint details hidden in the background began to emerge with unsettling clarity. The blurred shapes of trees sharpened, the grain of the environment grew more distinct, and most importantly, strange markings that no one had previously noticed became visible along the bottom edge of the frame. They resembled small scratches at first, the kind caused by improper storage or mishandling. But their pattern was too deliberate, their placement too symmetrical, and their repetition too intentional for them to be accidents. These markings curved into shapes that almost formed symbols, though no historian in the room recognized them at first glance. One of the senior historians leaned closer, adjusting his glasses as he inspected the image through high-resolution magnification. The symbols were small, some so faint they barely registered to the naked eye, but the moment he enhanced the exposure on the digital scan, a series of consistent, recurring shapes revealed themselves. They looked ancient, almost ritualistic, as though carved or inscribed by someone who understood the importance of precise geometry. Yet they did not correspond to any known alphabet, runic script, or historical cipher that the team could identify. The historian's brow furrowed as he traced one of the symbols with his finger, not touching the original photo, only the digital projection on the screen. The symbol looked like a circle with jagged lines breaking out of it, almost like fractures radiating from a central point. Another symbol resembled an eye with no pupil, elongated unnaturally, stretching downward as if melting. The third appeared humanoid but distorted, as though it depicted a figure bending in a direction bones should not allow. The deeper the historians looked, the more perplexed they grew. Most photographs from that era showed nothing of this nature. People rarely altered their photos, and if they did, the changes were obvious. But these markings looked integrated into the image, as though they had been present at the moment the picture was taken. That alone was enough to unsettle the team, for it implied that whoever or whatever had inscribed these symbols had been physically present during the capture of the photograph. One historian suggested the markings might be a photographer's signature or an old processing artifact, but the idea was quickly dismissed. Photographers usually signed their names or initials, not haunting geometric shapes. No known camera malfunction produced intentional-looking symbols that ran along the frame with mathematical precision. As the team continued their examination, attention shifted back to the shadowy figure in the background. Under enhanced light, its edges changed subtly. The figure still lacked detail, but now faint lines around it became visible, lines that matched the symbols along the frame. It was as though the figure itself was made of the same strange geometry, connected to the symbols not stylistically but inherently. This realization brought an uneasy silence to the room. One historian whispered that perhaps the figure had been drawn onto the image long after it was taken, but that theory fell apart when the team observed that the figure cast a soft, natural shadow consistent with the lighting conditions evident in the rest of the photograph. Someone or something had been physically present in that moment, yet remained undetected by the two friends. The most troubling discovery came when they compared the photograph to others from the same era and region. The researcher who found the image had brought along a few additional photographs from the antique shop, hoping they might contain similar anomalies. Most were ordinary, depicting families, homes, landscapes, and gatherings. But one photograph, taken years earlier and seemingly unrelated, contained a faint symbol resembling the fractured circle found on the mysterious image. The symbol appeared near the edge of a family portrait, barely visible, as though fading. This discovery unsettled the historians deeply. It suggested a pattern, a recurrence, something deliberate. Symbols don't appear across unrelated photos unless someone intends them to. One historian grew so intrigued that he searched through archived local records, hoping to identify the two friends in the photo. If he could trace their origins, perhaps the symbols would make sense. But the records offered little clarity. Census lists showed their names once, then abruptly stopped. There were no marriage records, no employment documents, no wills, no mentions in newspapers. They seemed to have lived quietly and vanished quietly, leaving behind almost nothing except the photograph. The historian wondered if the lack of documentation was ordinary, a matter of poor record keeping, or something more deliberate, more ominous. The coincidence was too unsettling to ignore. As the days passed, the photograph seemed to take on a life of its own within the archive. Historians who worked near it reported strange feelings, sudden chills, the sense of being watched, the instinct to look over their shoulders even though the room was empty. One assistant described hearing a faint rustling sound whenever she walked past the drawer where the photo was stored, as if something inside shifted slightly. Another claimed the symbols looked darker each time he examined the photo, as though ink was slowly spreading along the edges. Eventually, they brought in a specialist in ancient scripts and pattern analysis. He was confident at first, certain that any symbol could be classified with enough comparative samples. But when he studied the symbols closely, his confidence dissolved. He declared the markings unnatural, not just unknown, but unaligned with any linguistic, mathematical, or ritualistic system known to humanity. He said they seemed to be not written but manifested, as though the symbols formed themselves without human intervention. He hesitated before adding that staring at them for too long gave him a feeling he could only describe as being observed by something without eyes. And yet, despite all the confusion, unease, and fear the photograph stirred, the historians could not stop analyzing it, drawn to it as though the image had anchored itself into their curiosity, compelling them deeper with every passing hour. Uncovering the forbidden legend began not with a dramatic revelation but with a small, almost forgettable detail buried in a historian's notebook. After days spent analyzing the symbols and struggling to classify them, one of the junior researchers grew restless and decided to visit the local historical society of the town where the photograph was believed to have originated. She hoped to find names, maps, or old folklore that might offer context. Instead, she found a dusty binder labeled Unverified Local Accounts, filled with stories that had been purposely excluded from official archives. Some were harmless myths about lost gold, wandering spirits, and cursed wells, tales people told around firesides when trying to frighten children. But tucked between two yellowing pages was a brittle sheet of paper carrying a handwritten account dated more than 80 years ago. The handwriting was shaky, the ink almost faded, but one phrase stood out clearly enough to grip her attention: the presence that follows only the marked. The phrase sparked something in her mind, a faint echo of familiarity. She remembered one of the symbols on the photograph resembling a broken circle, and another shaped like a distorted eye. She flipped the page and discovered a crude drawing of a tall, shadow-like figure with elongated limbs, standing behind two people whose faces had been hastily scribbled out. Beneath that drawing were a few lines describing an old legend once whispered among locals living near the forested outskirts. According to the account, the figure was not a ghost or demon in the traditional sense but a watcher, an entity that appeared in moments when a life was about to diverge from its natural path. The legend claimed the presence only revealed itself to cameras, reflections, or shadows, never the human eye. People believed that seeing it in a photograph marked an irreversible destiny, especially if the symbols appeared with it. The researcher felt a chill crawl down her arms as she read, for the description matched the mysterious photo too precisely to be coincidence. She returned to the main archive and presented her findings to the team. At first, they brushed it aside as typical folklore with no real historical value, but the more they examined the handwritten account, the more troubling the parallels became. The symbols in the drawing were nearly identical to the ones etched along the frame of the photograph. The scribbled-out faces of the two people in the legend sketch were positioned in the same way as the two friends in the photo. Even the posture of the shadowy figure behind them matched the blurred silhouette captured in the image. What unsettled them the most was the note scrawled at the bottom of the page: "Those who are followed vanish from memory before they vanish from life." It was a disturbing statement, but when paired with the fact that the two friends had almost no records of existence, the line felt less like folklore and more like a warning. One senior historian who had spent decades studying regional myths realized he had encountered something similar long ago but dismissed it as nonsense at the time. He retrieved an old field journal where he had once documented interviews with elderly residents from the nearby villages. Flipping through the pages, he found a passage where a woman described a shadow traveler that only appeared in photographs. She claimed that families who found such figures in their pictures often suffered strange tragedies. Livestock died inexplicably, houses burned without identifiable cause, or individuals disappeared during routine tasks like collecting firewood. The woman had insisted the entity attached itself to people with the markings, almost as though the symbols acted as invitations. The historian had once regarded her as superstitious, but now, with the strange photo sitting on the desk before him, he felt a crawling sensation at the base of his spine. Driven by a mix of fear and fascination, the team began cross-referencing the legend with historical events. They reviewed old death records, unexplained accidents, and missing persons files from the surrounding region. Patterns gradually emerged, incidents occurring within days of photographs that residents had once described as tainted or unsettling. Stories circulated of people burning their own family albums after noticing dark shapes behind them, shapes that vanished if viewed casually but reappeared when examined closely. One particularly disturbing account described a girl who saw the figure in the reflection of a lake moments before she drowned. Though the authenticity of these stories could not be verified, the sheer number of similar descriptions across decades implied that the legend had deep roots, far older than the surviving documents suggested. The historian who first noticed the strange figure now felt increasingly uneasy. He began having recurring dreams where he stood in the same forest clearing as the two friends, hearing someone breathing behind him though he never turned around in time to see anything. He tried to rationalize it as stress or imagination, but each time he woke, he found the photograph slightly shifted from where he had left it. No one in the archive admitted to touching it, and the security camera showed nothing unusual. The dreams grew more vivid as the team uncovered more of the legend. One night he dreamed of hearing a whisper, not in any language he recognized, but carrying a tone that felt more like a command than a plea. The next morning, he found the symbols along the edge of the photo appearing slightly darker than before. As the legend became clearer, so did the implication that the entity did not merely observe, but selected. The markings were not random decorations but tags, identifiers, something like a silent claim. The camera had not accidentally captured the figure, it had exposed it. And according to the handwritten notes from the old binder, once the markings appeared around someone, the entity followed them relentlessly. It was not aggressive in the way stories of ghosts often were. Instead, it was patient, watching quietly, waiting for a particular moment that no account ever explained fully. Some speculated it came for souls. Others believed it fed on forgotten memories. A few thought it was not from this world at all but drawn to fractures in human fate. The legend did not say what happened to the marked individuals, it only stated that they were never seen again, and that those who tried to uncover the truth risked drawing the markings to themselves, inviting the presence into their own quiet corners of life. The vanishing records began subtly, so subtly that no one noticed at first. In a place where thousands of documents shifted daily and old files were constantly being scanned, moved, or restored, a missing page here and there could easily be blamed on misplacement or human error. But the disappearance of information related to the two friends in the photograph didn't feel like ordinary loss. It felt intentional, almost methodical, as if something, or someone, was erasing their past piece by piece. It started when one of the researchers attempted to locate census data confirming the birth dates of the two men. The digital archive showed the files existed, but when he clicked the folder, it opened to a blank screen. No corrupted images, no error messages, just a completely white page that refused to load anything further. Thinking it was a technical glitch, he checked the backup servers, but the folder was empty there as well. He brought the issue to the IT department, who insisted the files had been intact only the day before. Yet now, every trace of them, down to their file names, had vanished without explanation. As the team continued their investigation, the problem worsened. Microfilm reels containing newspapers from that era suddenly had missing segments precisely where any mention of the two friends should have appeared. Old obituary records, once stored neatly in chronological order, now showed several torn pages, their ripped edges disturbingly clean, almost as if they had been removed with deliberate care rather than damaged by time. Paper records kept in sealed boxes for decades were found with pages missing from their centers, like invisible hands had reached inside and plucked out only the information pertaining to the men. The archivists were baffled, especially because many of the materials were kept in climate-controlled rooms accessible only by staff badges. Security logs showed no unusual entry records, and the cameras revealed nothing except still, silent hallways even during the hours when documents disappeared. The researchers grew increasingly uneasy. The timing of the vanishing records coincided almost perfectly with their deeper analysis of the photograph and the symbols etched along its frame. It was as though the more they uncovered, the more the world resisted their efforts by erasing the trail behind them. One historian half-jokingly suggested that the photograph was trying to protect its secrets, but the strained silence that followed made it clear no one found the remark amusing. Fear flickered behind their eyes, a quiet understanding shared among them that something unnatural was threading itself through their work. More troubling than the missing documents were the strange experiences reported by those who handled the photograph. A graduate assistant tasked with scanning the image claimed she felt a sudden chill on her neck, like icy breath, even though the room temperature was stable. Another researcher described hearing faint whispering near the storage cabinet where the photograph was kept, whispers that grew louder the longer he stood there, though he could never make out the words. One night, the head archivist stayed late to catalogue old maps when he heard what sounded like a soft knock coming from the drawer where the photograph was stored. He froze, listening. The knock came again, deliberate and slow. When he opened the drawer, the photograph lay still, exactly where it had been placed. Yet he felt something in the air, a tension, a heaviness, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The vanishing of the physical archives was only part of the problem. Even information stored in people's memories began to slip away. The researcher who had originally found the photograph in the antique shop returned a week later hoping to ask the shopkeeper more questions, but the elderly man only stared blankly at the picture. He insisted he had never seen it before, not even claiming it had come from his shop. When the researcher reminded him about their conversation, the shopkeeper grew defensive, saying he would never keep such an eerie item in his store. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and his eyes darted toward the corners of the shop as if he feared something unseen might be watching. The researcher left feeling unsettled, wondering if the man was lying out of fear or if something had truly taken the memory from him. As more records vanished, the team attempted to reconstruct the missing history through secondary sources, but even those began to fail them. Books that mentioned local folklore or referenced unexplained incidents in the region were found with entire chapters missing, pages ripped so cleanly that not even a scrap remained. Some books simply went missing from their shelves altogether. Even online sources proved unreliable. Articles that had once discussed old legends related to the area now returned 404 errors or showed altered text with no mention of any such stories. It was as if history itself was folding inward, sealing off all paths that could lead back to the truth behind the photograph. Tension grew within the team as paranoia settled like a dark fog. Some believed a person was deliberately sabotaging their research. Others feared something far worse, something connected to the figure in the photograph. A young historian admitted in hushed tones that she felt like someone was following her on her walk home from the archive. When she glanced back, she saw nothing but empty streets and deepening shadows. Another researcher claimed he saw a figure standing behind him in a reflection on his computer screen, but when he turned, the room was empty. The air felt colder the closer he got to the photograph, and he often found it difficult to breathe when alone in the same room with it. The deeper they looked, the more the world around them seemed to rearrange itself, erasing every trail leading back to the two friends and their impossible photograph. Even the historians themselves began questioning their own memories. Some swore they remembered reading documents that no longer existed. Others felt certain the photograph had once looked slightly different, its symbols less dark, its shadowy figure less defined. The changes were subtle, like something shifting just out of sight, but enough to ignite a quiet terror inside them. The archivists realized they were not simply researching history anymore, they were fighting against something that did not want to be remembered. Something that erased facts the same way it erased people. And the more they pushed forward, the more aggressively the past dissolved behind them, as though the forbidden legend was not merely a story, but a force determined to conceal its own existence. As the historians prepared to unveil their final conclusion, the atmosphere in the small archival room grew unbearably heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for someone to acknowledge the truth they had sheltered for decades. What began as a simple curiosity about an old village photograph had spiraled into something far more unsettling. And now, with every piece of the puzzle aligned, the picture no longer looked like an innocent snapshot from the early 1900s but rather a sealed confession that had waited over a century to be heard. They stared again at the two friends, Elijah and Thomas, standing stiffly in a field with the wind tilting the tall grass around them, their expressions too guarded for boys who had supposedly been enjoying an afternoon outdoors. It wasn't the eerie shadow behind Thomas that had taken center stage anymore, but the strange consistency with which that shadow appeared across multiple unrelated photos from the region, each time positioned exactly the same distance from the nearest living person, always slightly angled as though observing rather than participating. The discovery of Thomas's old journal only added to the growing dread, especially the passages where he described dreaming of a figure that watched him from the edges of consciousness, never blinking, never touching, just watching. The historians found themselves repeatedly returning to phrasing that felt too mature for a teenager of that era. Words like encircled, claimed, and anchored filled the pages, along with drawings of a tall, blurred humanoid shape with limbs that always seemed longer than anatomically possible. Yet the most disturbing detail wasn't the shape itself but the way Thomas described feeling heavy, as though something was pulling at his bones when the figure came too close. Over time, the entries became fragmented, jittery, as if the writer's hand couldn't stay steady, and each drawing devolved into frantic scratches, all circling the same symbol that was later found in the background architecture of buildings from the abandoned outskirts of the village. This symbol, etched into foundation stones and carved into beams, was the same one faintly visible on the tree trunk behind the two friends in the photograph, though it had taken digital enhancement to reveal it due to weathering and decay. By now the historians understood that the appearance of the shadow was not incidental or paranormal in the childish sense of the word. Instead, it was ritualistic, intentional, and deeply rooted in a belief system the village had once embraced and eventually abandoned, likely for reasons that were becoming clearer with every document they uncovered. The old records they translated from brittle parchment described an entity the villagers believed dwelled in the boundary between the human world and the stillness, a place they considered a reservoir of forgotten souls. They believed this entity could grant longevity, clarity, and protection from disease, but at a cost. Every generation, one person had to willingly allow themselves to become an anchor for the being, a living tether keeping it connected to the physical world. The chosen anchor was marked not by a ceremony but by proximity, as the entity selected whoever noticed it first. It fed on acknowledgement, on recognition, and once chosen, the individual wouldn't realize what had happened until symptoms began, shadows stretching in unnatural directions, reflections lagging behind movements, and the persistent feeling that someone, or something, was standing directly behind them even in an empty room. The historians read further into the documents, finding testimonies from those who had survived the entity's influence once its anchor died. They described how the village fell into a strange quietness afterward, crops failing, families fleeing, and the church bells ringing at odd hours with no one inside. This destruction would continue until the entity found a new anchor, and the record suggested that the villagers eventually destroyed their own rituals, sealed the remaining symbols, and abandoned any mention of the being to starve it of recognition. But the photograph suggested that the entity had already found another anchor, someone young, vulnerable, and unaware. Thomas, according to village death records, died within the same year the photograph was taken. His cause of death was listed as unexplained collapse, and his burial location was lost due to a flood that wiped out half the graves in that area. Elijah lived much longer, but his descendants reported he had frequent night terrors and refused to have his picture taken, going so far as to destroy every camera that came near him. The historians understood now why the villagers had worked so desperately to erase the entity from memory, for every act of acknowledgement was a form of invitation, and the photograph itself, circulated across online forums and historical blogs, had gained more attention in the past few years than it ever had when the boys were alive. Recognition was spreading again. The entity was being seen, remembered, studied. And the final, most horrifying discovery came from a contemporary photograph taken by a tourist visiting the overgrown ruins of the old village last summer. The tourist's image, innocent at first glance, showed nothing unusual except a faint, elongated shadow positioned precisely the same distance behind her as the one that had stood behind Thomas. The historians realized that the entity had not died with the village, it had merely waited, dormant, until someone uncovered its image and gave it form again. And now, with the photograph being shared, analyzed, and magnified by thousands of eyes across the world, its reach had expanded beyond anything the villagers could have imagined, leaving the historians with a chilling understanding that by studying it, they too had become part of its recognition, part of its tether, part of the cycle it required to step forward again into the world of the living. The historians gathered in the dim archive one last time, the photograph placed at the center of the table like a silent witness awaiting judgment. None of them spoke at first. The room felt colder than usual, as though a draft had slipped in through cracks that hadn't been there before. When the overhead bulb flickered, they all froze. No one wanted to be the one to look behind them. Finally, Professor Hale reached out and turned the photograph face down, but it didn't help. They could still feel the same presence pulsing beneath it, the same awareness watching them with the patience of something that had waited over a century to be seen again. One by one, they tried convincing each other that the best course of action was to destroy everything, the journals, the symbols, the recordings, even the digital scans. But each attempt to act brought a strange heaviness to their limbs, like invisible hands resting on their shoulders, urging them to sit back down. None of them admitted it out loud, but they all felt the same word forming in their minds, a whisper without sound: too late. It was only when the youngest historian, Mara, noticed a shape forming in the reflection of the glass cabinet that panic finally broke the paralysis. There it was, blurred, impossibly tall, its outline bending in ways the human body wasn't meant to bend. It didn't move, didn't advance, didn't even breathe. It simply stood, mirroring the same position it had taken behind Thomas over 100 years ago, as if patiently waiting for acknowledgement. When Mara's voice cracked the silence with a trembling "Don't look behind you," everyone understood that the thing in the reflection wasn't bound to a single person anymore. The recognition was shared. Their gazes had tied them all to it. The next morning, the archive's door was found unlocked, lights still on, but the room was empty. Only the photograph remained, still face down, though now marked with a long, dark smear across the back like a handprint made of shadow instead of flesh. The authorities claimed the historians fled, leaving their work in fear of some undisclosed discovery, but those who knew them refused to believe they would abandon their life's research so suddenly. No one could explain the sudden failure of every camera in the building that night or why the security footage showed nothing but static during the hours they disappeared. The photograph was eventually sealed in a private collection, but not before an intern made the mistake of scanning it for the records. That scan still circulates in hidden corners of the internet, reposted by users who insist there's something standing in the background if you zoom in far enough. Most dismiss it as a trick of the light. Most. And yet, every few months, someone claims that after viewing the image, they feel a strange heaviness, as though a presence is lingering just a few steps behind them, waiting for them to turn around, waiting for that one fatal moment of recognition that will anchor it once more to the world it has been trying so patiently to enter again.